Hey there, it's LegenTerry. At this point, I've spent about 2 weeks with the Nintendo Switch 2 since it came out on June 5th, and I've got quite a lot to say about it. I'm going to start off going over the hardware specs of the console and what it does that the original Switch didn't, and then we'll talk about the games and the software side and how much it's all going to set you back. I'll put detailed information up on the screen for you to pause and read at your leisure, but I'll mainly be speaking about the things that you should actually care about. And hey, don't forget to consider liking the video and subscribing, it would really help me out. Let's start with the size. The very first thing you'll notice is that the Switch 2 is massive. Not in thickness, but it's both wider and taller. It absolutely dwarfs the Switch Lite, is bigger than both the standard and OLED models, and for anyone trying to make size comparisons to something like a Steam Deck, it's slightly smaller, way less bulky, but the screen on the Switch 2 is actually larger than both versions of the decks. It's roughly 35% heavier than the original Switch as well, giving it a more premium feel. And since we're on the subject, the way that the tablet body and the included Joy-Con controllers feel to the touch is very nice. Nintendo has whipped up some kind of specially blended paint that feels almost like a soft velvet in the hands. It's got a matte black finish that's textured ever so slightly, with cyan and salmon colored accents around the thumbsticks and on the inner grips. This is the only colorway at launch, and in my opinion, it looks like a more serious piece of tech. It gets away from the toy-like look of the original red and blue Joy-Cons, and it looks more sleek than the flat gray set while keeping a splash of color. The main body of the console has two USB-C ports, one on the bottom that's centered and one on top that's offset. Either of these can be used for charging, which is really great news for people that enjoy playing in tabletop mode, but only the bottom port can be used to dock the system. No turning the console upside down in the dock funny business. This top port does, however, allow you to plug in accessories like the Nintendo Switch 2 camera while it's docked. I'll talk more about that in its own separate video covering most of the extra first-party accessories later. Now, if your headphones don't work with USB-C, which I'm just going to assume they don't because they don't really have a reason to, never fear. Nintendo has kept around the standard 3.5mm audio jack, unlike a lot of smartphone manufacturers. Or, you could just use Bluetooth instead, which is actually built into the console this time and doesn't require a patch. Thank God. There's also two USB-A type ports on the dock, so you can still go wired that way if you need to, or use the ports to charge your extra controllers. The speakers on the console have been improved, getting way louder and somehow sounding even clearer despite the bump in volume over the original. There's also a new kickstand design that folds out from the bottom in a U-shape that kind of surprised me. I thought it would click into some preset positions, but instead it's just really stiff. It just kind of holds itself wherever you push it. It's like it's being supported by hydraulics. And it has a very wide range of motion, up to about 150 degrees. That means it can lay nearly flat on a surface while giving you just that little bit of freedom to not crane your neck over the top of it. Back to the Switch 2 Joy-Cons, more has changed than just the colors and relative size. All of the face buttons are slightly larger, the shoulders wrap around on the top corners further, the trigger buttons are deeper, and the sticks are much smoother. All of this sounds great for people with larger hands like myself, but let's address the elephants in the room. These are not Hall Effect sticks, and as someone who has experienced drift on both pairs of the original Joy-Cons that I own, it does make me a little wary to see that the internals are nearly identical. I really hope the mechanics behind the new ones are less prone to drift, but only time will tell. However, there is a pretty sound explanation for why they didn't go the Hall Effect route in the first place. Interference. Unlike the rail system that we once knew, these Joy-Cons connect to the main body with magnets. They snap on easily with zero pressure at all and make an almost completely rigid connection by jumping into these big grooves along the edges of the screen, while these little tabs slot inside the Joy-Cons. And to disconnect them, you pull these release triggers, which makes the spring mechanism push the controllers out from the inside. Because of the weight, I wouldn't recommend holding the console up with just one Joy-Con, but the magnets are strong enough that you can do it. And if you didn't know, Hall Effect sensors use magnets to determine the position of your thumbsticks in real time. So if the magnets in the Switch 2 are strong enough to hold the controllers to the console, it's a small leap in logic to assume that Hall Effect sensors would receive all kinds of messed up signals if Nintendo tried putting them in there. Moving on, you probably noticed the other stuff on the inside part of the new Joy-Cons. The SL and SR buttons are about 3 times as wide now, and for good reason. Not only does it make it easier to press when holding the controller horizontally, but they're also made of steel. These are what the magnets inside the console actually latch onto. The Joy-Cons also snap into the new Joy-Con grip that comes with the console in the same way, giving you a more traditional controller shape to hold them when they're split. Though I don't like how there's not a rolled curve that meets the front edges of the controller anymore. There's just kind of a flat gap due to the way that they need to be slotted in from the sides rather than the top now. Also, this is the normal grip, not the charging grip version that's sold separately for $35. You don't get the extra back paddle buttons, and you still have to put the Joy-Cons back on the console to charge them. Either way, I don't love the ergonomics. They don't provide an angle for your wrist to naturally rest, so if you have big hands, your thumbs will always rub up against the right joystick when you go to press the B or the Y face buttons. Next to those inner SL and SR buttons is the optical sensor that lets you use either or both of the Joy-Cons as a computer mouse. The new Joy-Con straps that are included snap over the edge of the controllers and give them little plastic platforms for more stability and to keep you from rubbing away the actual controller's points of contact. Right now, there are only 3 or 4 games that will allow you to use the mouse mode, but since I don't play Fortnite and I didn't want to buy Cyberpunk again, I haven't really been able to get a good sense of how they feel. You can play around with them in the home menu, but there's no real point besides showing it off as a parlor trick for your friends. I don't think that your hands will be comfortable in this position for more than like an hour in a real play session. These are probably the least ergonomic versions of a mouse that you'll ever hold, and I still haven't figured out where to place my thumb. Like, do I put it on top of the joystick where it feels like it's gonna wobble and move whenever I move my hand? Or in front of it where there's barely enough room, or maybe behind it? And do I use both of the top buttons or just one for the mouse click? I have no idea. None of these positions feel correct. But it has been confirmed that the Switch 2 can accept a traditional mouse input as well for shooter and RTS games, which is probably easier on the wrist and the fingers. I do think this is a pretty cool gimmick that could be great with the right third-party accessories. I've seen some mouse cradle designs crop up on Amazon already, and some people are just straight up 3D printing their own. That just about covers the controllers, so let's move on to the other big talking point, the screen. This is a whopping 7.9-inch LCD panel with a resolution of 1080p, up to 120Hz with variable refresh rate, HDR10 support, and it's still a capacitive multi-touch display. It looks very good in person, though I know a lot of folks are disappointed that it's not an OLED display. It might feel like a bit of a downgrade for those who had a Switch OLED model, but you also have to factor in a couple of things. That was capped at 720p resolution, and it bumped up the price by a pretty big margin compared to the original model. If the Switch 2 came out with a 1080p OLED screen, you would likely be sacrificing that 120 FPS capability, and you'd be paying a premium price of at least an additional $50 to $100. As a guy that plays almost all of his games docked anyways, along with about half of Nintendo's audience, I think they made the right call with this one. If you are a handheld gamer, I think you'll still be pretty happy when you see the screen for yourself. It's really vibrant and still gets relatively bright with a fantastic picture quality, and as a reminder, the screen does support VRR and HDR10. Though the TV that I own is about 8 years old and doesn't have HDR built in, so I'm not the foremost expert on whether or not this version stacks up to how good other devices make it look. I do think you'll be surprised at how large the console feels to hold in your hands. It keeps your shoulders spread a little bit further apart, which is better for your posture, but as far as ergonomics for your hands are concerned, again, the Joy-Cons are just lacking in any kind of grip or curvature. It just kind of feels like you're holding up a wide slab of dense plastic. The Switch 2 comes with 256GB of internal storage, of which about 249 is usable because of space taken up by the operating system. If you take a look at the back of the console, there's still an included slot for additional storage beneath the kickstand, but this time around, Nintendo has opted for new technology in the SD card space. Just like their bigger cousins on the market, they realize that they need a lot of speed to make games load faster and to stream high-fidelity visuals. So instead of using standard microSD cards like the first Switch, the Switch 2 can only use microSD Express cards. Now, these are not proprietary like the Xbox's memory cards, but they are practically a brand new innovation, and that currently comes with a hefty price tag and means that they're nearly impossible to find. A 500GB microSD Express card from Lexar ran me about $100 a couple months before the console came out, and I haven't seen the same ones restocked since. In fact, the Amazon listing that was there has been replaced by one for their standard microSD card that won't work, which is really strange and annoying. The internal 249GB would get you pretty far storing most first-party Nintendo titles digitally because they have really good methods for compressing their own games, but the size of third-party titles are going to devour that memory in no time. Just make sure when you're shopping for these that you know exactly what you're getting, because the marketing and the labeling around these are confusing as hell. The last bit of hardware inside the console I should mention is the battery. You'll get enough juice for about 2 to 2.5 hours playing a graphics intensive game like Mario Kart World, up to a max of about 5 to 5.5 hours playing an indie game like Deltarune. Of course, that's all subject to change based on your environment and your settings, like the level of brightness that you leave your screen at. There's also a sort of widespread bug with the Switch 2 that makes your battery percentage display incorrect values, but there's an easy official workaround that only takes a couple of minutes to fix the problem. If you get one and notice your battery numbers bouncing around randomly or draining way faster than it should, just give it a quick Google and follow the links until you find a support article. Unfortunately for me, I had an actual defect with my unit that's harder to diagnose, but it looks like it's an isolated incident. My right Joy-Con has something loose inside of it, maybe a screw or some kind of plastic piece that rattles around. I didn't notice it until the day after I got it, and I thought it might have been just the gyrometer or something, but after talking to someone else who bought one about theirs, it sounds like I just have bad luck. As far as I can tell, it doesn't seem to affect any of the controls, but it's not exactly pleasant, so I guess I'll try to get it replaced while it's still under warranty. Thoughts about the console itself and my own problems aside, I think the biggest mistake that Nintendo made with the Switch 2's hardware might be the newly revised dock. Now, it does exactly what it's meant to do. It displays your games on the TV and allows it to output up to 4K at 60fps or 1080p and 1440p at 120fps. We'll talk about more of that in the software section. Also, at launch, it isn't capable of doing VRR when docked for some reason, but they could eventually patch it in like Sony did for the PlayStation 5. Anyways, what I meant is that this dock is just a couple of flimsy pieces of plastic stuck together that feels like it could break if you looked at it wrong. The build quality is not good. Unlike the original, which was squared off and rectangular, this one has a big old bubble butt to accommodate a fan that cools the internals. In order to plug in your HDMI and AC adapter, you have to completely remove the back cover. Why they got rid of the hinge design or couldn't just make it to where the ports were on the outside, we may never know. But when you go to put it back together, it's something that you can't really do blind. There's a specific way that the door's clips settle back into the shell, and you really need to look at the back of the dock to see where they're going. And while you're plugging in cables and putting the door back on, you want to make sure you don't squeeze the two protruding fins at the top of the dock together too hard, because they will flex and probably crack apart if you're not careful. I'm genuinely pretty disappointed that Nintendo didn't spend some of their development budget on making the dock a bit less fragile and better designed overall. I would have loved it if they had made it more compact and portable like the third parties have been doing since the original Switch, or at least made it not completely hollow and given it this dumb sandwich shape again. I'm almost positive you'll hear stories about these things getting destroyed a little after Christmas when a bunch of kids get their hands on the Switch 2. And now we can finally talk about software. I mentioned earlier that the Switch 2 can output up to 4K at 60fps or 1080p and 1440p at 120fps while docked, and this is true. But that is just what it's outputting, not what it is rendering natively most of the time. Some of you already know where we're going with this. At the highest quality settings in some games, Nintendo is using their own version of Nvidia's DLSS technology to basically generate something like 1 and 3 fake frames between every real frame to make gameplay appear smoother. It's not a unique feature to the Switch 2 alone, as their competitors are starting to experiment with similar techniques as well, but it does seem like they're trying to keep extra quiet about it. My guess, they probably don't want to muddy their messaging and make the conversation all about raw horsepower, where the Switch 2 falls slightly behind because of its form factor. But I can find literally zero information about it on Nintendo's website, and that feels very disingenuous and kind of anti-consumer in my opinion. Of course, if you're buying a Nintendo console, you're probably just looking to play a lot of games that are exclusive to the system anyways, so none of that really matters. The Switch 2 launched with one really big new game, a couple of smaller new games, and a pretty big smattering of older games being ported over alongside improved Switch 2 editions of Switch 1 games. If you're getting a Switch 2 right now, I'm going to take a wild guess and assume that you're picking up Mario Kart World with it. That is the one big game. This is not a review of Mario Kart World, so I'll leave my complete thoughts on that for another day. I understand why this was the big launch title for the Switch 2. Mario Kart 8 is the best-selling Nintendo game of all time behind Wii Sports, which came as a pack-in title for the Wii, so that's kind of cheating. But I do wish there was more than just an arcade racing game here for us to chew on. Like, there's the Switch 2 Welcome Tour, which is a game that should have been a pack-in title, but instead they're charging $10 for it. Don't buy that, trust me. But it is kind of weird that we have to wait a whole month to play Donkey Kong Bonanza, a 3D platformer, and that there isn't a follow-up to Super Mario Odyssey anywhere on the horizon. But at least it looks like they have a decent stream of first-party releases with games like Pokemon Legends ZA and Metroid Prime 4 Beyond scheduled to come out before the end of the year. If you're going shopping digitally for those titles, you'll be pleased to know that the experience of the Switch 2's eShop is much better than it used to be on the Switch 1. There's no more waiting through a lengthy loading screen with a little arpeggiated jingle slowly driving you nuts anymore. It pops up almost instantly and right into the featured tab, and everything else loads just as quickly. They changed the way their algorithm pushes games in the great deals, bestsellers, and recent releases tab, so there's less $2 shovelware garbage and questionable content floating to the top. It is still there. Oh god, is it still there, fermenting at the bottom of the barrel like a stew made from toxic sludge. But at least it's a couple layers deep, and it isn't front and center anymore. They even added a For You section that gives you personalized recommendations based on what's new, what you and your friends have been playing, and what you've looked at on the eShop previously, which gets updated with new recommendations once every Saturday. It's a neat little addition. Oh, and this is still shared with the Switch 1's eShop, so everything that's backwards compatible is here too, with Switch 2 titles being distinguished by this little red banner at the top of their thumbnails. For now, I've personally enjoyed playing Fast Fusion a lot in my spare time. To be clear, it is another arcade racing game, but it's more in line with something like F-Zero or Wipeout, just without the weapons. It's one of the best visual feasts on the platform, and honestly, one of the best values too at only $15. I've played Fast Racing Neo and Fast RMX before on their respective platforms, but I've never been sucked in as deep as I have with this one. It also allows you to choose which one of 4 different graphical modes that you want to run it in, which makes it pretty good for comparisons. Digital Foundry did some testing, and they've said that there is a little bit of weirdness going on with how shadows and detail are being rendered in this game, and that the developers are gonna patch some stuff, but it still holds up really well to my eyes, besides the occasional jumping shadows or textures popping in at odd times. This is the Ultra Quality mode, which I wouldn't recommend unless you're a big fan of motion blur since it's locked to 30 FPS. Here's Performance mode, which is the smoothest but drops the quality substantially. And finally, here's Quality mode, which is a good middle ground and my preferred way to play. There's also a balanced mode that's similar but runs at 1440p instead. I just didn't want to bother completely changing recording settings so I could get 1440p footage. I also picked up Deltarune, which you saw earlier, but that's kind of a weird one since it only adds part 3 and 4 of what will eventually be a 7-part game when it's complete. Also, I played part 1 and 2 on Steam, but there is no cross-save. So they let you start the game at chapters 3 or 4, so you technically don't need the save, but then you also lose all the extra stuff that you found in the first 2 chapters. I don't know, man. I played it for a couple of hours, but maybe I'll just do a complete reset later and start over from scratch. Most of my time has been dominated by popping in Switch 1 games to see the differences in quality. The Switch 2 is almost completely backwards compatible with Switch 1 games, with only a handful being left behind because of incompatibility issues, and under 1% of the 15,000 titles working, but having bigger problems. That's due to the Switch 2 using an emulation layer to play the Switch 1 games, rather than including all of its original components. Some of the games, most notably party games, and oddball stuff like 1-2-Switch, WarioWare Move It, and the Nintendo Labo kits won't work correctly unless you're using Switch 1 Joy-Cons, because the new ones are just too big to fit peripherals, or the game requires the IR sensor in the bottom of the original right Joy-Con. By the way, most controllers that worked with the Switch 1 are forwards compatible with the Switch 2, but Switch 2 controllers are not backwards compatible with the Switch 1. Try to remember that the next time you're getting a local 8-player Smash game together. Also, I might as well mention this before I forget, but none of the media apps like Hulu, YouTube, or Crunchyroll currently have working Switch 2 versions. YouTube has said that they're working on one, but everyone else has been pretty unclear about their progress so far. With the backwards compatible Switch 1 games, there's essentially 3 different categories they fall into. A, the game runs basically the same on the Switch 2 with few to no improvements. B, the game got a free upgrade on the Switch 2 that enhances frame rate, resolution, or both. And C, Nintendo released a full-on paid Switch 2 upgraded version of the game that improves frame rate and resolution, and has had even more work put into it, like better textures, audio, new features, or additional content. The A category is self-explanatory. A game might just run better because the Switch 2 has a faster processor and can push more power. But the B and C categories are a little more interesting. There's a list on Nintendo's website that details all the games in the B category and what happens when you put them in the Switch 2. I'll go ahead and throw these up on screen and put a link down below just in case more get added in the future. I spent some time capturing footage from the Switch 1 versions of some of these games before the Switch 2 launched, just for comparison's sake. And just to preface this segment, these were mostly recorded in 1080p. I only bothered to capture some 4K footage for the true Switch 2 games, those being Mario Kart World and Fast Fusion, because this was my first time recording 4K footage, which takes up 4 times as much storage space as 1080p footage, and I am not made of money to buy extra hard drives. Now, some of these make a pretty small difference as far as I can tell because they were already great looking games. For example, Super Mario Odyssey and ARMS. The resolution was improved, a bit of anti-aliasing was added, some frame drops were fixed, and the load times got shorter, which you would expect. Some of them, like Zelda Echoes of Wisdom and Link's Awakening, were brought up from a state of being good, but hard to look at, to being completely awesome. These games had substantial framerate issues, and some bugs with the visuals on the Switch 1. But now they look totally smooth and play perfectly on the Switch 2. Last but not least, the pair of games the entire world critically panned for their technical performance when they came out, and the ones you're probably most curious about, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. On the Switch, these ran miserably. They looked extremely underbaked and were completely riddled with bugs. They quickly became the internet's punching bag, which is a pretty fair reaction when you consider that Pokemon is the highest grossing entertainment franchise of all time, and the companies that had a hand in their creation decided that they were in an acceptable state to sell to people. Well, we're finally getting a peek at what these games could have looked like if they had been optimized in the first place. I'm not saying that the artistic direction, the dull environments with flat textures and repeated tile sets, or the insanely bad pop-in or bugs got fixed, but they did receive a massive glow up in terms of overall performance. They now run at a stable 60 frames per second no matter where you go, and when docked seem to run at 1080p or 1440p resolution that gets upscaled to 4K. It's almost like playing an entirely different game. Almost. This is on top of Game Freak allowing more Pokemon to spawn near you, which makes the world feel much less dead and empty than before. We're talking about going from a maximum of about 15 spawning in the area to roughly 40 at once on screen. It's crazy to think that there's so much of a difference between the Switch 1 and Switch 2 versions that it actually affects the gameplay. In the 1.5 hours I messed around getting footage, I actually managed to find 4 shiny Pokemon completely by happenstance, and I probably even missed 1 or 2 since I wasn't actively looking for them. As an aside, the updates to the other games that I mentioned only took about 3 to 4 minutes to download each. The update to Pokemon took almost half an hour on its own, which is pretty telling about the adjustments and fixes that they needed to make. Finally, we can talk about Category C, the paid upgrades. Nintendo is officially calling these Nintendo Switch 2 editions. Right now, the only 2 that are available are Zelda Breath of the Wild and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, but at least 4 more that we know of will be released by the end of the year. Super Mario Party Jamboree plus Jamboree TV, Kirby and the Forgotten Lands plus Star-Crossed World, Pokemon Legends ZA, and Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. The good news is that I'm pretty sure all of these will be available at no additional cost if you pay for the Nintendo Switch Online Plus Expansion Pack subscription, which is $80 a year and supports up to 8 people. If you do the quick math, that's $10 a person annually, and the Switch 2 edition upgrades cost $10 each without the subscription. Probably worth it if you have family or friends that plan on playing any of these, not to mention the other benefits which I'll need to briefly cover in a few minutes. Back to the point, I only bothered booting up a Tears of the Kingdom save since it and Breath of the Wild use the same engine and the same map. But the difference in quality between the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 version is immediately noticeable. It gets the same treatment as the other games. Upscaled 4K resolution, 60 FPS, and better load times. This is the definitive way to play these games now, and I don't think I could ever go back to the original version. In tier specifically, the Switch 1's processor had a very rough time whenever you assembled something with more than a couple of pieces using the Ultra Hand ability. And certain areas that were densely populated, like the Korok Forest in both games, which I forgot to get footage of, used to bog the frame rate down to the mid-teens. But the Switch 2 version does not get impeded at all. Besides that, if you have the Nintendo Switch app downloaded on your phone, you can connect it to these games and use your phone as an interactive map with GPS functionality and voice navigation included. And there's some additional content where special spots activate a voice note from Zelda herself, who adds some extra context and lore to the locations around the world.
A memorial. It is said that spirits who are weighed down with regret when they pass on sink deep beneath the ground and wander in search of light.
There's even a way to share auto builds and get daily bonuses. If you haven't managed to play these games yet, they're some of the best Nintendo games ever made, and now they're in an even better condition than they were before. I highly recommend them. Now that we've covered the Switch and the Switch 2 games, let's go back to a simpler time. If you have the Nintendo Switch Online Plus Expansion Pack subscription, the Switch 2 now gets access to select classic GameCube titles on top of the other console lineups that were available on the Switch. At launch, we got F-Zero GX, Soul Calibur 2 featuring Link, and one of my personal favorite games of all time, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. And they have some new features. You can play them with normal visuals, or add the new CRT filter. You can remap your buttons to make them feel more modern, and you can even create your own save states. They can all be played in the classic 4:3 screen ratio with enhanced resolution, but if the game supports it like F-Zero GX and Soul Calibur 2 do, you can make it widescreen too. And over in the Nintendo 64 Console Classics app, they have added the CRT filter too, along with the new rewind function. They're also adding online multiplayer to GameCube titles, which is awesome. I wanted to try this out with Soul Calibur 2, but I haven't gotten around to doing it yet, so I don't know if Nintendo's netcode will function as well as it needs to basically stream one person's game onto the other person's console. Hopefully their online service works better than it did before. Speaking of which, Nintendo finally modernized most of their online service. You probably noticed I never mentioned this new little C button on the Joy-Cons when I was talking about them earlier, and that's because I knew I'd have to open this whole can of worms. Once you've added a friend, you can now invite them to a Gamechat, which works just like Xbox and PlayStation's party systems, with some extra pros and cons. I guess I'll start with what I like. Sending invites and joining someone else's Gamechat group is really easy. You just click the C button, scroll down to the friends that you want to invite, and as long as they set up stuff on their end, they can hop in with their voice and a video feed as well. That's something I never would have expected from Nintendo of all companies. You don't have to fiddle with a phone app anymore, you can all be playing whatever games that you want when you're talking to each other. It's actually done well. Now, this layout might look a little unattractive, but you can adjust it. I know I was really worried about this before launch since they only showed this one view, but you can make your own screen larger or just full screen it and completely get rid of everyone else's boxes and video feeds. That allows you to put your friends' identifiers in one of the corners or just hide them all together if you don't need them to recognize voices. Now here are the caveats. Whenever your friends decide to share their screen or use a camera, these feeds run at about 10 FPS and they're crushed down to about 1/4 of their original resolution. It ain't great, but at least you can kinda see what's going on from their perspective at a glance, and it doesn't impact the performance of your own game, which is probably more important. I would have also liked it if they let you overlay someone else's box on top of your own screen and just let you move it and scale it where you want it yourself, but I suppose beggars can't be choosers. Another kind of sore spot is the microphone. Instead of being present on one of the Joy-Cons or even the Pro Controller where I think one deserves to be, the microphone is on the tablet part of the console, which will likely be docked for most people playing online. They're using some of the same tech that Nvidia cooked up a while ago that's able to isolate voices from background noise and punch it up. It is usable, and what it's able to pick up is honestly kind of impressive, but after trying it with a friend, I would not recommend using it if you're further than like 10 feet from your system. It starts to sound distant and garbled unless you're in complete silence and raising your voice a little bit. If you're serious about playing online, do yourself and your friends a favor and just grab a Bluetooth headset with a mic attachment. You probably already have one laying around anyways. After all of that is said, here are my final thoughts after 2 weeks with the Nintendo Switch 2. This is a great step up from the original Nintendo Switch, which is something we have been begging for years. It does everything bigger and better, and it is a gorgeous piece of tech that should serve everyone well for many years to come. Right now, my biggest problem is the lack of feeling like this is something brand new rather than just a long overdue upgrade, and that comes down to a couple of key factors. For one, the form factor is nearly identical to its predecessor, even down to the user interface level. Nintendo took the safer and probably smarter route by not going out of their way to reinvent the wheel. There isn't a new wacky idea or gimmick leading the way, like glasses-free 3D or a controller that expects you to have 3 hands. They settled on catching up to the rest of the pack by making a considerate boost in processing power, allowing for more intense graphical fidelity, shorter load times, and features that were once completely impossible to implement with their weaker hardware. This all comes with a $450 price tag, or $500 if you got the Mario Kart World bundle that might be difficult for Nintendo fans to swallow, even though I think that price is fair for what you're getting if you were to compare it to similar systems on the market which don't get access to Nintendo titles. At least not legally. Secondly, the current games library is a little lacking. Right now, it feels like there's just not a ton to play if you aren't interested in Mario Kart World, which if you plan on playing solo wears thin on content pretty quickly. It also costs $80 if you didn't happen to get the digital bundle version, which is completely unjustified on Nintendo's part. It's good, but let's be real, it's not $80 good. While I do think the launch lineup is an improvement over the original Switches, most of the games of the Switch 2's launch are just ports of older titles. It's lacking in originality and excitement. Plus, most third-party developers have opted to put their games on store shelves as game keycards, which have all the frustrations of buying digitally and needing to download a game, with the inconvenience of needing to pop in a physical cartridge whenever you want to play it. Nobody really likes them besides publishers looking to save a buck, and they just made selling people on the idea of the Switch 2 more complicated. I want game keycards to go away, and I think most people would agree. Putting a review score on hardware that's completely reliant on its software and a lot of outside factors to be thoroughly enjoyed is kind of weird. If I were simply reviewing the aesthetics, the build quality, and the capabilities of the Nintendo Switch 2 itself, along with the other things that come in the box, I would rate this at a 9. It feels like a premium product that's set to do a lot of cool things, eventually. But as it stands, the other stuff around it, like the inflated prices of some of the games, and especially the accessories, and the absence of titles and features that should act as fundamental pillars supporting the console, drags it down. However, as bare as it seems, I've already had a lot of fun just playing around with it and seeing my old library have new life breathed into it. I'm also feeling pretty optimistic about the games that have been announced and the ones that are just around the corner. So, after 2 weeks with the Nintendo Switch 2, it receives an 8 out of 10.